Hello again, everyone. It's Kevin Adkisson, curator with the Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research. And today I am coming to you live at 5 from the Cranbrook Art Museum Collections Wing. And I have asked the registrar at the Art Museum to pull out for our enjoyment today the bed hangings of George Booth, which were embroidered by and designed by May Morris in London in 1916. And while other people join us, if you have not had a chance to visit Cranbrook Art Museum since 2011, you may not know that we have added on this incredible collections wing area. And so the vault that I am standing in today is full of the permanent collection of the Cranbrook Art Museum, including the recently restored wheels of Julia Schmidt's cannon that will be part of an exhibit next summer and then go back on display. Pieces from recently acquired from a graduate of 2020 to Andy Warhol, to the wonderful painting racks, which scroll back in the Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research Facebook videos. And you'll see a tour I did in the early fall about some of the paintings here. The rolled up rugs of Loya Saarinen, and then of course the fabulous wall of furniture. Now, today's Live at 5 tour is not going to be about any of these exciting objects. Hopefully tours of the collections wing will restart in 2021, and Cranbrook Art Museum and the curators and visitor services and the staff of the museum are going to be more than happy to take you on a tour through the collections wing. Part of the storage of this amazing facility designed by Smith Group, JJR of Detroit, is that it also is home to the Cultural Properties Collection. So at Cranbrook, we call cultural properties items that contribute to the design, to the daily life, and to the history of Cranbrook. So things like the dining hall furniture are all the furniture in Cranbrook House. The sculptures that are around campus are architectural fragments that are on the grounds, all the way to light fixtures. There's some 8,000 cultural properties. It's my job as the associate curator to try and keep them in use and on the grounds. But when things become too fragile or they become rooms change, buildings change, we do sometimes have to remove cultural properties, and we store them here as part of the Cranbrook collection. Now, these objects, as we move into the focus of today's Live at 5 tour, were hanging in Cranbrook House from 1920 until 1955. At that point, they were given to Cranbrook Art Museum. So these, though they come from Cranbrook House, and most of Cranbrook House's objects are cultural properties, these are in fact part of the Art Museum collection. And why, pray tell, would we have that little distinction? Well, these are works of art. There are obviously cultural properties that are works of art, but the decision was made in 1955 that these should be really part of the Art Museum's permanent collection of excellent examples of handicraft and excellent examples of design. So, what is the background of these bed hangings? I'm going to tell you a little bit of history about May Morris and how these hangings got here to Cranbrook, and then I will take the camera around and we'll do a close look at this wool and linen embroidery work. These panels date to 1916, and they were produced by May Morris and a teacher, Mary Newell, who was working at the Morris Studios. And you probably know the name William Morris. William Morris was May's father. And William Morris was the great father of the English arts and crafts movement that became one of the first real international styles that spread around the world, came here to Detroit and helped inspire George Booth to be one of the founding members and first president of the Detroit Society of Arts and Crafts. And so William Morris was a public intellectual, he was a designer, he was a lecturer, he was an author, he was a bookmaker. He also worked in textiles and architecture and wallpaper design, cell phone cases with his wallpaper design. And so William Morris was world-renowned for his designs. Now, his wife was Jane Morris, who was a model. She was a model for the pre-Raphaelite painters. Pre-Raphaelites are the sort of arts and crafts equivalent. If arts and crafts are decorative arts, pre-Raphaelites are the fine artist. So she was a model and a muse to William Morris, and she was also a needleworker. And so their daughter, May, who was born in Bexleyheath in 1862, she learned design and sort of social causes from her father, and she learned technical skills of needlework from her mother. And by the age of 23, she became the first woman working in Morris and Company, which was his commercial studio. And by 1885, she was head of the textile division of William Morris and Company. Now, she left that after her father's death, and she became director of design at the Central School of Art and Craft in 1899 in London. And she really was this champion of not only the arts and crafts, but also of her father's legacy. So she maintained his archives, she published his collective writings, and then she also was advocating for the same causes he beloved, mainly socialism and the sort of distribution of capital, as well as the right of the artist and the value of quality design and handcraft. A lot of times in America, our arts and crafts movement doesn't have the political aims, but May Morris was a fighter, as we will learn. These bed hangings came with quite a bit of political drama. And so I mentioned that her father had all those many hats. And May Morris, up until her death in 1938, she was considered really a businesswoman, an author, a lecturer, as well as a designer and fiber artist. And so when she led both Morris and Company textile division, but then especially after 1899 when she was at the Central School of Craft and Design, May Morris was really fighting for the value of women in arts. And so she helped establish the Women's Guild of the Arts and Crafts in London because the Arts and Crafts Society of London did not allow women members. And she also condemned the economic situation of needlework and of textile arts, saying that they were undervalued, they were underpaid, and that if you kept devaluing the textile product, you devalued the worker and you devalued the person as an artist, and there would never be sort of economic aims. And so she had this real strong message about women and handicraft, and her father had never come to America. People had invited him. Oscar Wilde told him it was great fun and he should go, but William Morris refused. He thought America was a capitalist wasteland with no hope, and that American arts and crafts really missed the whole point of his movement. May Morris felt the same way about America, but in 1909, she decided that she would embark on a lecture series. And a lot of the news accounts and reporters at the time sort of thought, well, May Morris is coming to America. She's coming to fight for the suffrage movement as much as she was to talk about design. Ostensibly, the title of her lecture series was about medieval tapestry, but it was this sort of women's rights movement, as well as praising that these medieval tapestries were not some hobby, that this wasn't a hobby art, but in fact, it was a fine art with trained artisans who were valued in their society as we should now value the women who were doing embroidery in her time. One of her stops on this 1909 to 1910 tour of America that May Morris embarked on was the Detroit Society of Arts and Crafts. This is the little building that used to be down on I think Jefferson Avenue. The land was donated by George Booth. It was designed by Buck Stratton, and it stood until well into the 21st century as part of the College of Creative Studies. And inside the Detroit Society of Arts and Crafts, they would have exhibits, and it was a shop. And so you could come into this multifunction space. Do you see there's a stage up here? And there would be all sorts of crafts, mostly English, but also Danish and German and American, as well as crafts made at the Society, so in the Detroit workshops. And you could come and you could see great examples of art. And George Booth and the other leaders of the Detroit Society of Arts and Crafts thought that this would be a place where sort of Detroit industrial production, the worker, the layman, could come and see excellent examples in design. So people like the Booths were going to shop here, but then the workers could come and they could study the great examples of European and American craft. It was here on this stage that May Morris spoke in 1910 and met George Booth, and they did start up a correspondence that continued. It was also here in 1920 that we see the Bedhangings arrived. And so there's 2 tapestries here on the Detroit Society of Arts and Crafts stage. This was a 1920 exhibit of English design. And so you have bed hangings, the side panels, and then the valance. There's also a headboard with embroidery. And then you have this tapestry by Edward Burne-Jones, which was designed for stained glass in the 1880s and woven at the Morris and Company Mills in the late 19th century. And then George Booth bought the hangings out of that exhibit, and here we see the hangings at Cranbrook House in George Booth's bedroom, again with the valance and then the side panels. Now, that tapestry was actually on loan from George Booth. So George Booth already owned the Solomon and the Temple weaving by William Morris and Burne-Jones. That's now in the Christchurch Cranbrook Library. And just to give you a sense of what they were looking at, this is William Morris's own bed at Kelmscott, which is where May Morris lived until 1938. So her parents' manor home in the English countryside. We see a similar example of embroidered bed hangings in this medieval style. So part of the arts and crafts movement is essentially everything that happened after the Renaissance is terrible. And so it is looking at sort of the age of the great guilds of craftspeople and the great cathedral age. And so then we should live in a sort of modern example of that handicraft. So I know that was a lot of history for Live at 5. I hope that you enjoyed it and learned some, and I'm indebted to a scholar whose name I did not jot down. I am remiss there. I'll type it in the comments, who wrote a wonderful essay about May Morris and her trip to America in 1909, 1910, and the sort of feminist mission of May Morris and her work. So what was her work? It was embroidery. And so we are looking here at one of the bed hanging panels. It's wool threads on a linen ground. And if I zoom the camera in, we can see all of this wonderful hand work where the design, which would have been sketched out on paper first and then transferred with a pencil or tracing paper or a crayon, some sort of transfer, and then all of the colors are brought to life with these wool threads on the very simple linen ground. And so it has this real sort of honesty to the materials where you have these just, materials of the earth, linen from flax, wool from sheep, and then it's directly here. So the linen is undyed, it's unbleached. It has age, so it would have been brighter in 1916, but it's darker now. But it's that sort of idea of being very true to materials. And I love as we look at the characters that are in this embroidery, just the way that these birds and grasses come to life. If you were on my Live at 5 on Instagram yesterday, you know that I talked about the peacock gates and the way that Eliel Saarinen designed peacock tail feathers in iron. Here we have, this might be a grouse, a wood grouse, but again, the sort of artistic opportunities that come with feathers and depicting the natural world. I mean, let's just see, how many colors does she use on this tail feather alone? We have 2 blues, then the sort of gray blue, the red, the orange, the green. And that combination of colors and of it creates depth. So as I pull the camera away, the colors become more like shadow and they add life to these creatures. Now, Mae Morris grew up, I mean, her father was a socialist radical, but also very upper class and rather wealthy. And so she grew up in a series of sort of Edenic landscapes outside of London. She called London the most horrid place ever found on earth. And so she preferred to be out in the castles that were some of their family members or other sort of estates. And as a girl, she was often getting in trouble from her nanny because she would take pebbles and plant specimens and she would stuff her pockets full and she would rip her clothes. And she seemed to be, based on her diary that was just recently rediscovered, to be much more interested, she writes, much more interested in the nature of the world than in people. And so she, I think, comes to this embroidery. She's a master artisan at this point, but she brings to it this sort of girlhood interest in nature and in the natural world. Of course, William Morris also believed nature to be the root of all of his designs and his wonderful wallpapers, but it is different to see it through Mae's eyes and the way that she creates this sort of world of birds, trees, and I don't know what those big flowers are, peonies, flowers. So we see the little birds here who just hatched. How long would it take to make something like this? That is a great question. So it was Mae Morris and Mary Newell. When I took the tour of Red House, William Morris's house in the suburbs of London, there was our guide told us the wonderful story as we were looking at all these embroidered panels. And he said, here's the finished panels, and here's all the ones they started. Because part of the arts and crafts ideal was celebrating the that went into these pieces and celebrating the handcrafted. George Booth was very different in his interpretation of the arts and crafts. He thought you celebrate the handcraft, you celebrate the genius of the maker, but not everyone's a genius and not everyone can afford that. And so at some point you transition, and this was his idea with Cranbrook and the Arts and Crafts Studios in 1929, what's now the Art Academy, was that at Cranbrook we would focus on the handicraft in the studio, and then we would discuss and we would bring those pieces into production. So something like the Charles Eames and Aerosarin and chairs back here, these were handmade at Cranbrook first, and then they went into industrial production. William Morris and Burne-Jones and Mae Morris and that whole circle of arts and crafts, they rejected the industrial part. And so when I took this tour to Red House, there's all these half-done embroideries because these things would take a year. I mean, they could take months. And you're a sort of upper-class society person, even if you're going around in a sort of, potato sack to give out the pleasures of the earth. They were still busy people with robust lives and lecture series and events. And so the idea of them sitting all day embroidering didn't quite jive with the actuality of their work. And so something like this, that is why there are two makers, because it was probably Mary Newell who was, the driving force of finishing this in time for the 1916 11th annual exhibit of the arts and crafts in London. And so these were done between 1915 and the opening of that exhibit in 1916. When the panels were finished, they were shown in London to great acclaim. You look at these little birds, and how could you not love this? And then they were published in 1917 in a book about London arts and crafts and the sort of status of the arts and crafts world. Very possible that George Booth would have seen them at that point because, of course, Booth was buying all of the books that were coming out of London, out of the arts and crafts movement. So it's possible that George and Ellen Booth knew about these pieces even before they came to Detroit. I wish I had a better answer as to how long it would take, but I think a safe guess would be 6 months to a year. And again, that is working with May as the sort of lead artisan and the lead designer. And then she has her associate, Mary Newell, who is also working dedicated on these pieces. Now, they are, of course, a pair. And so if I step back, we can see how they are not perfectly symmetrical. So nature is not perfectly symmetrical. Instead, they have this very natural, balanced asymmetry. And so you see the way that the flowers are at the same line as it goes across. You have birds in both corners, though you have male on one side and female on the other. And then you have the sort of density of trees at the top. So they're coordinated without being perfectly symmetrical. And so if anyone knows a lot about birds, I don't know if my dad is watching today. If you have better ideas on what these English birds might be, feel free to type it in the comments. But they're not identical on either side. Interestingly, when these were given to Cranbrook Art Museum by, or rather transferred from the Cranbrook Foundation, George and Ellen Booth left everything in their house to Cranbrook. When these were transferred from the foundation to the art museum, the decision was actually made to sew them together. And so until 2007, these were actually understood and displayed as a unit, as a sort of piece of wall tapestry, more like what you might see in an Asian art gallery. And they sort of lost their function as a bed hanging. I don't know if any of you had a chance to go and see these at the Cleveland Museum of Art at their William Morris retrospective last year, but it was the first time since 1955 that they had been assembled as bed hangings, and so the valance and headboard were also sent to Cleveland and used on display. Thrushes, partridges. So if anyone else has any questions, I'm happy to take them. The question about the Solomon instructing David in the building of the temple hanging, the Burne-Jones hanging that we looked at in my short little PowerPoint at Christ Church Cranbrook, that is in excellent condition, and Christ Church Cranbrook are phenomenal stewards of their collection of fine and decorative arts. Of course, the Cranbrook collections and the Christ Church Cranbrook collections were built by the same family, George and Ellen Booth, as well as their children. And for many years, they were maintained as sort of one community of objects. Since 1973, the church has been on its own. And George Booth was rather clear about leaving things to institutions. So even though that tapestry was at Cranbrook House for many years, he gave it to Christ Church Cranbrook. And they're very aware of its importance, of its value, of its beauty, and it is maintained and restored by the same art conservators that we use here at Cranbrook for the museum objects and for cultural properties. So Fran Fail of the Detroit Institute of Art is who vacuums these pieces, who does any mending. She's the one who separated the panels in 2007. And of course, Christ Church Cranbrook, which has limitedly reopened, but once in the future, at some point, I invite you to go and sign up for a tour with one of the docents over at Christ Church Cranbrook, because their collection of decorative arts is really one of the strongest collections of arts and crafts works in America, including the largest tapestries that William Morris and Company ever produced were made for Christ Church Cranbrook. And they made those 25-foot tapestries and then closed for business because it was the Great Depression. So would other panels like this have existed? Not for this set. So for this set, it was again produced for that special exhibition in London. And I mean, there's photographs of that exhibit in London. So you can see this in 1916. You can see it in the book. And so she was making this to be not a product sample, because I mean she was selling them, but she was really doing this for show in the same way that sculptors and artists and makers did, special exhibits at the Met, like Eliel Saarinen did in 1929 with his dining room, or like for the World's Fairs, where artists would produce pieces to be testaments of their artistic practice. In fact, one of those is right over here, Tor Berglund's demonstration piece of his skill, the Swedish craftsman who immigrated to Cranbrook to be our woodworker. This is a chest that he made for Cranbrook to be his sort of journeyman's demonstration of skill in America. So tropical hardwoods inlaid with peacocks on the interior of those doors. So you can think of a piece like this that wasn't made for a room, but was made for a demonstration of skill. You can think of these as that same way. Much like Eliel Saarinen's fireplace or his dining room set were made for exhibits and then used in his house, these were made for exhibits, traveled around the country, or traveled around England, traveled around the US, and then purchased by one of the people who liked May Morris, George Booth, because I would love to open the cabinet. I don't have the key, though. It is locked, and there's a skeleton key. The one thing I neglected to mention is that people really did not like May Morris. The New York Times described her as a snail receding into her shell and not this great feminist that they were expecting. I think these critiques of her are also tied up in gender norms of the day, and people like Gustav Stigli, the great American craftsman who produced with his brothers this chair, Gustav Stigli hung out with May Morris on 3 occasions, and then he spent the rest of his career writing against her and how she was the worst thing to ever happen to her father's legacy. And they did not get along at all. They were oil and water. But May Morris did some things that were also rather insulting, like calling the Roycrafters a sad imitation of her father's business. Why would I go and see them? And that was, largely considered America's greatest arts and crafts utopian community. So she was pretty opinionated, and she would give this lecture that was ostensibly about medieval embroidery, and then it would turn out to be about the suffrage movement. And of course, the English suffragettes were very different from American suffragettes. Mary Poppins does them a disservice. I mean, they were bombing buildings, they were exploding streetcars, so it was rather violent suffrage movement in England, and there was some thought of, was she bringing this to America? And then her strongest advocacy was for women's trade unions, and she thought that was the only way to get women's artists paid their dues, and that was very controversial to this sort of pro-union stance that she was advocating across the country. So it is interesting that George Booth, who, the Detroit News the evening news was the sort of paper of the people, it was the paper of the workers, and so his sort of pro-union stance or unannounced union stance, he then aligns with May Morris and is able to get these bed hangings, whereas so many of the people she met on her U.S. journey did not exactly stay as fast friends. So I hope this was a fascinating look into one of the beautiful objects here in the collection of Cranbrook Art Museum from the personal collection of George and Ellen Booth. I was just looking at Ellen's bed earlier today. It is entirely unembroidered. It's just a lovely damask fabric with a wooden frame. So George certainly had the more beautiful place to rest his head at Cranbrook House. If you enjoyed this tour, I selected these objects. Not only did they come to Cranbrook in December of 1920, or January, they were on display in late November, early December to Detroit Society, and then Booth purchased them during the show. So it is possible that he hung them around Christmas of 1920. And if you would like to learn more about Cranbrook and Cranbrook House and the Booths, I am with my friends over at the Cranbrook House and Gardens Auxiliary, which are the volunteers who help run the Cranbrook House Gardens and Cranbrook Gardens and Cranbrook House tours. I will be leading on Sunday, a special tour of Cranbrook House that focuses on the family and the holidays spent at Cranbrook House. So from the first Christmas in 1908, when the Edison Electric Company had not yet gotten the electricity to the house, and so they had to do the whole thing by candlelight, to the Christmas of 1918 or thereabouts, when one of the sons gave his parents a parrot who proceeded to eat all the walls, to the Christmas 1941, when the entire Booth clan, at that point some 30-odd members of parents, kids, and grandkids, walked from Cranbrook House from supper over to the construction site to meet the Saarinens and to see the new art museum under construction. These are just some of the tour stories that I pulled from Cranbrook Archives to tell you on this special 75-minute tour all about Cranbrook House and the holidays. I am going to be joined by 4 other tour guides who are volunteers from House and Gardens, and so they are going to be zooming in. It's a high production event, and we're going to be interspersing my walking live tour with slide images as well as stories from these other docents and volunteer leaders. I think it's going to be a great tour. I have been busy setting up Cranbrook House and moving every piece of furniture slightly so that it looks more like it did in 1920 and less like it did in 2020. So I have reconstructed their Christmas tree from 1914. I have reset the table with a historic tablescape. You don't want to miss this tour. It's going to be a lot of fun. And that is this Sunday, December 13th, for $20. You can buy tickets at center.cranbrook.edu. And your ticket price is going to be supporting both the Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research and Cranbrook House and Garden. So we're splitting the profits, and of course, neither of us have had tours this year, and so these special virtual events, I love bringing you live at 5 for free, but if you're able to come and support the paid events, those are what help me have a job and what help us preserve and tell the stories of Cranbrook. I think it's going to be a really unique tour. It's again at 3 o'clock. If you are watching this into the future, well, hello from today. You can buy this ticket and watch this tour later as well. Just email center@cranbrook.edu, and we will tell you how to get that $20 donation to receive the link to watch the video recording of the live tour. With that, I think I will take my leave of the empty collections wing, set the alarm, and I hope that you enjoyed this deep dive into just a single object in the remarkable intersection of William Morris, May Morris, George Booth, Ellen Booth, and now here at Cranbrook Art Museum. Thanks again to Corey Gross, the registrar of the museum, for pulling these out of storage for me in the midst of also processing a huge project on the other side. And remember to follow the Art Museum's website to make sure you can see when this building will reopen for tours. And you can see the tapestry at Christ Church Cranbrook on tours, so follow the church as well to see when those tours will restart. I'm not sure any of these will happen till May, but remember them, and next time you visit Detroit, it's even more to see. Thanks so much, everyone, and I will see you next Wednesday for another live at 5, but hopefully I'll see you even sooner on Sunday for Home for the Holidays at Cranbrook House. Good night.